Hello, I'm Chris Flisher, and welcome to Turning of the Wheel, an intelligent, lively discussion on astrology, art, and adventure. Timing is everything, and as the great wheel turns, we are best prepared when we are best informed. Join me as I explore the current planetary alignments and offer insights for coping with change. Educational, informative, enlightening, the Turning of the Wheel is a welcome pause in your daily swirl of constant change. Through intelligent discourse, inspired guests, and educational segments, I will help to enlighten your knowledge of astrology and guide you to accept change as the great wheel of life turns. Call in with your questions and speak with some of the greatest visionaries in the time-tested practice of astrology. Turning of the Wheel, Astrology, Art, and Adventure with Chris Flisher, each week on Turning of the Wheel podcast.
Hello and welcome to Turning of the Wheel. My name is Chris Flisher. As you know, this is a show about astrology. And in my efforts to keep this show going, I try to reach out to some of the most brilliant people in the world of astrology to discuss topics that I think are pertinent to all of us and are curiosity subjects more than anything else. I love talking about the logic of astrology, the evolution of astrology, why astrology works, all those big topics. Because it's such an obscure and unusual art and science, I think it's interesting to sort of delve into different people's opinions about why astrology works and why it's so successful, how it can be used in our lives on a daily basis. My guest today is Bruce Scofield. He is the owner and the person behind OneReed.com is his website. And it's not Reed as you may think. It's ONEREED.com. Bruce Scofield is a noted astrologer from Western Massachusetts. He's highly published, highly regarded in the world of astrology. And we're having him on today to discuss certain ideas about sidereal and tropical astrology and how they work. Because in some ways, you think about it, astrology as a divination tool should theoretically work across all branches of astrology, whether it be Mayan astrology, whether it be tropical astrology, whether it be sidereal astrology. They should all work, or they should at least come up with some sort of similar conclusion. And that's going to be our topic today. So, Bruce, welcome to the show today. It's great to have you on.
Well, thank you.
So we were talking a little bit before the show, just the idea of, I threw out the idea of, just as a sort of a talking point to get the show going here. I've always held the contention that if you took 3 different or 4 to 5 different astrologers and put them all in the same room, and they all had different methodology for interpreting a chart, would they, do you think, arrive at the same conclusion? I know there's caveats involved in that, but theoretically, just as an overarching theme, they should really all arrive at the same thing, because they're all divination tools are based on the same birth data, correct?
Yeah. I mean, if the first requirement is that the astronomy is the same. I mean, we're basically dealing with the same problem that we're having, culturally, where you have different sets of facts. You have things like alternative facts, and that's the first step that has to take place. Is you have to agree on, what the reality is, and if you can't do that, it's a free-for-all. And I think that has been happening in astrology for a long time because of the porous and flexible nature of interpretation of, qualitative analysis. But, it's obviously happening in the outside world as well, where people completely disregard scientific facts. I mean, the scientists can can send a probe to a Kuiper Belt object and fly within 2,000 miles of it, but apparently they can't get climate change right.
Right. And that seems to be insane.
Yeah, it is. This is a cultural schizophrenia that we're experiencing right now. And I think that if you're a critical thinker, you can get through it. But the media bombardment is such that critical thinking is weakened in a lot of people. And there are a lot of people that are educated in subjects that don't teach critical thinking. So it's a problem. But getting back to astrology, assuming that everyone is using the same astronomy, in other words, that they're getting the planetary positions correct, you would think, and if they agree that reality is a certain way, then they should come up with, reasonably similar, descriptions of what's going on. There are some issues, though, because some people just don't understand things very well. Now, my experience in astrology is that a lot of people have relatively superficial understandings of events, how an event is transpiring, and relatively superficial understandings of differences between people, and they rely heavily on definitions from one particular author or another. And And that's a problem. People will argue on Facebook as to, like, what does, Eris mean, or what does, Venus mean, or planetary definitions. And I see a wide range of things, and what I see is that many people are stuck on what I consider to be a very narrow tunnel vision. And, I've spent my whole life trying to, broaden my vision, and I tend to see things in certain ways where it's got to the point where if I describe what's going on to some people, they don't get it, and they actually think I'm wrong, but I know I'm right, and it turns out in the end I am. So if you step back far enough, theoretically, you should have a pretty good grip on what's real. And the problem in astrology is that most people are not standing that far back. They
don't have the objectivity to really wrap it up.
No, that's something that you've got to be trained in. And astrology it's an amateur field. It's a collection of almost all amateurs, and that's not a bad thing. People amateurs love their subject. But if you applied the same rules to the field of astrology that, say, nurses or surveyors, and I'm not even mentioning lawyers or doctors, right? Have to go through, it would knock out a huge chunk of that, population. So, it's okay that that's what it is, but, I'm calling a spade a spade.
Mm-hmm. And I think the problem, it comes down to sort of the level, because astrology is a complex divination tool, or,
Well, that's a whole other argument in itself. And that has to do with the definition of astrology, and if you want to get into that, I'd be glad to talk about it.
Well, that is an interesting subject in itself. It's sort of a subset about this. One of the things I had thought about, I'm curious in some ways. As you pursued your study of astrology years ago, what was it that compelled you to do it? Was it basic curiosity, or were you trying to prove it wrong? I know in my case, I started studying it because I sort of was so baffled by how accurate it was that I was sort of on my quest to sort of disprove it in some ways. I was skeptical. I wanted to disprove it. I'm still skeptical. I think it's healthy to be skeptical in some regard, but when you keep getting empirical data that comes back and proves yourself right, it's hard to argue with that.
Yeah.
And how do you feel about that? Why do you think astrology works? What compelled you to get into it?
Well, I got into it because I had 3 girlfriends in a row born on the same day, and I had my best friends were born within a day of that day, which happens to be October 10th. And I thought that was pretty curious. I was a science major. I got into astrology in 1967. I was a freshman at Rutgers, and I was going to be probably a geologist or astronomer. I wasn't sure. I was in the science track. And I had a girlfriend who, born October 10th, second one, who had some books on astrology. And I took a look at them, and I was surprised how sophisticated it was. And, with that information and my slide rule at the time, I calculated a chart and started doing some of the calculations. And I started noticing that it was working. So that got me going.
Yeah. And as you subsequently got deeper and deeper into it, did you find were you also besieged with skepticism in some respects, saying, "Wow, this is so fantastic. How can this possibly be?"
Well, not really. I was taught in the sciences that it was a pseudoscience, but I also learned a few things when I was young about authority. And the other thing is that my father was pretty impeccable. He was very clear about boundaries and a pretty responsible guy, and I respected him. But I had experiences with other people, like a particular scoutmaster when I was a Boy Scout was such a jackass. He played tricks on everybody and was, didn't come through. And my first real job, the boss was an idiot. And, you come out of these situations thinking that the people that are running the show may not always be right.
Oh, of course not.
My father usually was. My father was usually right, but everybody else wasn't. So I had this skeptical. My skepticism was towards the judgment of the general culture, rather than my personal experiences with astrology. I thought my thinking was perfectly clear. I was observing things in my environment. I suppose you could say that in terms of science, my early training was observational science, which is descriptive science, like a field biologist or an astronomer. And I did spend a lot of time looking at the stars with a telescope and the planets, and I did spend a lot of time in the field observing animals. You know, and you know, so I came into it with that kind of a view. Physicists don't do that, but you know, the kind of scientist that the way I started, the kind of science I started with was like that. And so I thought my observations of the effects of transits and the descriptions of people that I met were very accurate, and my distrust was with the authorities. And so after, you know, a roundabout period, I got to my you know, senior, you know, I got through college, and you know, I went into a graduate program. I decided to take a look at the history of science and try to figure out, well, how did astrology get into this position? Because I couldn't get a clear answer anywhere. So that was a large part of my graduate work, you know, as a master's, was trying to solve that problem.
And it was a legitimate quest on behalf of the school that you were able to study the astrology as part of your curriculum.
Yeah, your voice is not coming through that clearly.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. You were able to get that authorized through the school as part of their curriculum.
Well, not really. What I did was, you know, I tried to do it as an undergraduate at Rutgers, and they wouldn't go for it. But I took a lot of courses that that I felt would help me think. Like I majored in history and minored in philosophy. I had switched from the sciences. What happened was I was in Rutgers for a couple of years, and then I dropped out and played in a rock and roll band for 4 years. And then I went back and finished up and got a degree in history. And then, you know, some time went by, and I did a master's degree in history of science at Montclair College University in New Jersey. And that guy, my advisor, was through the history department, but it was called, my degree is in social sciences. And I did a lot of work with history of science in the 17th century and the decline of astrology. And he let me study that and do independent studies and that sort of thing. And
you had to sort of step outside of the boundaries of the school in order to get sort of your own, you know, major decline, you know, your major declared.
Yeah.
And your
Well, it was the same major. It was just that he gave me a lot of room in terms of independent studies. But I still had to take 36 credits of, you know, social science. Mostly it was history. There was some anthropology and sociology.
Yeah. Well, you know, the history and sociology together really form the foundation for astrology in many regards, because you do see the social changes happening there on the outer planets, especially the longer transits. You see them totally keeping in line.
Yeah.
Like I feel as if we're perfectly matched for where we are right now, regardless of how confused we all are.
Yeah. Oh, certainly those. And also, I failed to mention that I took a lot of psychology too. So
exactly.
You know, so I have all those social sciences jammed in. That was, you know, my the basis of my understanding. For my PhD, I studied science. You know, I was in the geosciences department, and I focused on paleoclimatology and oceanography, and you know, things that basically allow me to look at climate science and say, oh yeah, it's real.
And it is real,
Yeah.
despite all the popular chatter that it isn't real.
Well, I haven't met anybody that knows anything that is in denial of it. I mean, you have these idiots in Congress that come in with a snowball and say, what's this? You know, it's not global warming. It's it's getting colder. Well, they have no understanding of the climate system. They just don't get it.
No, they totally don't. And they always preface that by saying, "I'm no scientist, but I don't think that climate change is real." But that's we are in a weird spot with the rest of the world right now in this regard to this. But the idea of astrology as a tool for people to use and grow. You and I both agree that it can provide enormous insights. And how do you sort of ponder the question why it works? How do you come up with an answer for that in some ways?
Well, that's a really complicated question. At present,
it is, I know.
At present there's two basic ways of explaining how it works, and one is the archetypal cosmology idea, which is basically a new version of holistic ancient philosophy. Neoplatonistic, Pythagorean, Hermetic, where you have there these ideal forms and, archetypes, and, they're represented by the planets, and, there's sort of, there's action at a distance, there's a number of ideas from quantum physics are sort of drawn into it, and maybe some ideas from system science, but not a lot. But it's basically a kind of an acausal, non-materialistic explanation for astrology that comes out of the social sciences and the humanities. Mm-hmm. So it's not really a science.
No, it's not. I always think of it as an art and a science. I think of it as a combination of the
Well, I'm not talking about astrology. I'm talking about an explanation for astrology.
I see. Yeah. So that's the same approach that Jung took, about the causality.
Yeah, Jung is like a major contributor to what's called archetypal cosmology. There were a few people about 20 years ago that put this together in California, and I think that it encapsulates a lot of these loose ideas. I mean, even things like, the evolutionary astrology ideas, they're loosely compatible with archetypal cosmology. The only thing with the latter is that it's a little more fully articulated as an explanation for astrology, and I think a lot of people like it because most people in astrology are not scientific in their thinking.
No, you're right. They're more emotional or more psychological based. Yeah. They look at it more that way in terms of a tool that helps them understand a person or help people understand difficult times they're going through. Yeah. So when you look at a chart and you can see this action happening. I had a client the other day who completely didn't even allow me a chance to speak to her because she was so under the weather with this. She's having an enormous Pluto transit, and she says, "I want to see the silver lining in it." I said, "Well, there may not be a silver lining right now. You may have to wait a little while for that silver lining to appear." I mean, you can always find something good in the chart. She's going to have Jupiter coming up to her Jupiter, so she'll be probably pulled out of that. But the fact that she's got a Saturn return and a Pluto transit at the same time in her first house, I mean, she's going to be going through significant changes, and it's apparent. I could see it so clearly, and I think that's what appealed to her, or that's what she wanted from me, was reassurance that this is going to happen. And I said, well, this is happening. It's pretty clear. You can see this in your chart. But and I think that there are people that are looking for something that is looking for some sort of an oracle almost in astrology, as if it's going to point the answer to the right direction, as if you go a certain way. But we have to admit that there's times when life is difficult and there's times when life is fairly easy, and it's through those difficult periods that people really tend to grow. And when you can identify them in the astrology charts, I think that can be valuable, because you can say, well, it's difficult right now because it's supposed to be difficult right now. So you just bite the bullet and go through it.
Yeah, well, that's astrology as a counseling technique.
Exactly.
And that's fine. But if we're talking about astrology from a broader perspective, we can't be anthropocentric, which is what 99% of astrologers are. That astrology is all about people. It's not. There's astrology of the natural world, like weather, like astrometeorology. That was that started right with the earliest astrology. Actually, the earliest astrology was what we would call mundane astrology, and that would include astrometeorology. But getting back to your earlier question about that I responded to, that there are two primary ways to explain how astrology works, and the first one being something like archetypal cosmology, that being probably the most organized of the modern holistic philosophies that are based in the humanities and the social sciences, maybe barely into the social sciences. But the other one would be some kind of a multi-link physical theory, whereby there is information transmitted to the Earth, probably used through the magnetic field, through variations in the magnetic field, that are read by organisms. That accounts for a lot of things. And if you look at the Gauquelin data, I mean, that's what he thought. He thought there was that he found the Gauquelin effect was much stronger for births that occurred during times of significant magnetic field disruption. And if you look at magnetic field patterns, which is a lot of work because there's so many different stations and different, you're measuring things in 3 dimensions and 4 actually in time as well. you can see things like moon conjunct, Jupiter or something like that. There's a little buzz that happens at that time. So a multi-link theory would be something like, the planets pull on the sun, which affects the solar activity, which then affects the magnetic field of the Earth, which is then read by organisms in various ways, since organisms are basically electrical. I mean, the cell is basically a situation where there are two different electrical potentials on each side of it. So the fundamental nature of life is electric. Mm-hmm. And electricity and magnetic fields are, more or less the same force. So
they're compatible. One drives the other. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's also, what I was suggesting before is that there's almost a direct effect on the Earth, like geocentric planetary effects that affect the field, and consequently life. And I have a model. I call it the developmental planetary imprint hypothesis. I have a book on it called The Circuitry of Self, and I have a scientific paper on it that's never been published, but it's online. And what I argue there is that the people that we become what we grow into is a result of these stages of development in early childhood and the imprints that we took, and that that there is a relationship between planetary cycles and the solar return. So, for example, the most obvious one is that at age 8, it's also your solar return. It's also your Venus return.
Right.
Or at age 13, it's also your Mercury turn. Or at age 2, it's also your Mars return. A little looser there, but it's in the ballpark. And so what happens is that at these certain stages, these periods of imprint vulnerability open up, and you take in the experiences you have are taken in and become part of you. And then by the time you're done with this, which is at about age 18 or so, the rest of your life is basically replaying that recording and seeking out surrogates to play out the roles.
And that's all based on time and place and influence of what happened to you at those times.
Yeah.
Which would explain why, if in the case of twins, I've got twin sons, well, when it takes to the idea of having twins have, of course, they're going to have the same returns because my twins are only 6 minutes apart. However, their environment at the time that they experience that, the influences that are outside that experience them at those particular moments, like the 8, the 2, the 13, the 18, all those times that you mentioned, though the particular place and time that they were at that time is going to differ for each child.
A little bit.
Yes, there may be underlying commonalities to them, but how their impressions are formed based on those influences at that time is going to be different per person.
Not to mention the fact that if you use solar arc directions, they're going to get hit at very different times. So up to a year and a half apart for the main solar arc, and up to 3 years apart for the half solar arc. Mm-hmm. That's a lot. I mean, so if you happen to have, suppose you're in the period between 2 and 4, which I argue is, almost any developmental theorist would refer to it as, basically the terrible twos, the point where muscle control is important, and independence, and saying no, and bad behavior, and testing the boundaries, all that goes on, right? Mm-hmm. So suppose one twin, the solar arc at age 3, let's say age 3, comes to Venus. But the other one, the solar arc, comes to Mars. They're going to have two totally different imprints at that time. Mm-hmm. But there will be, but because the rest of their chart is similar, it won't be drastically different. But it will account for, later on, significant differences in personality. And I think that the solar arcs and progressions and outer planet transits are really important in shaping who we are. And it's just that when you have a window of imprint vulnerability, when these things occur, it just gets retained.
Yeah, and I think that forms the basis of your impressions of life and Earth and relationship at the time, because your only data point that you have to, if you're on a playground, you're 6 years old, and somebody walks up and kicks you, your impression is going to be based on that, your reaction to that, versus another twin who didn't have that same situation. So his whole frame of reference is going to be out of kilter, which makes sense because they are individual people. They're not one of the same. They're not the same person. But twins are especially fascinating because of the birth time and stuff like that. But as you mentioned, those can vary dramatically, especially based on their impressions and their personality types.
In regard to my model, the developmental planetary imprint hypothesis, yeah, I've been talking about this since the first article I published on this was in 1987.
Wow.
So I've written on it a few times. It's sort of one of my, back burner projects that I've worked on. But the mechanism, that I've suggested is that there's a kind of resonance that's going on. There's a high sensitivity to the solar return. Now, what I think may be going on there is a sensitivity to what's called photoperiod. Now, photoperiod has to do with the length of day ratio, versus length of night, right? And it's known, I mean, this is like, an area of study in what's called chronobiology, that you have organisms that can find the time of the year very accurately to within a day or two. Like plants are real good at it because they have to know when to flower, when certain insects are coming around, and so on. But animals can do it too. So I think that it's embedded in our biology to recognize when it's our birthday.
I see. Yeah, that makes sense.
If
I can see that.
If at
it's
our
like a circadian rhythm almost. It's a rhythm of sorts.
Well, actually, in many cases, it is probably the case that photoperiod is a process, a kind of information or a kind of cognition that's built off the circadian cycle, and the circadian or daily cycle is now understood to be a product of a feedback loop established by a protein making cycle within the cell, within special clock cells that reside in a region called the suprachiasmatic nucleus in the brain. And they're fed information, photic information from the eyes and so on. And what goes on in the cell is that, the RNA, moves the, certain, messages, coded messages in the DNA to the cytoplasm outside of the nucleus, and brings it to the ribosome and tells it to make a certain protein. And this protein builds up and builds up and builds up until finally there's too much of it, and then the signal goes out to shut down. And then after a while, there's too little of it, and then it turns on again. So there's this natural rhythm in the cell that then becomes entrained to the external environment, to the light environment. So it's a combination of endogenous, inside and outside, behaviors or factors. So the
cells react that way via the natural cycle of time. The cells react to the changing of the seasons, and they sort of absorb that, and so that's why you sort of have this underlying preparation for that solar.
Yeah, I mean, circadian cycles exist in cyanobacteria, and cyanobacteria go back to probably 3.5 billion years. They're, like among the earliest life forms on this planet, if not the earliest. Well, they wouldn't be the earliest. Chemotrophs would be. But anyway, the cyanobacteria are definitely light sensitive because they're photosynthesizing. And they're in everything. I mean, cyanobacteria became algae, are parts of algae and parts of plants, or at least, their genetic material. And animals have learned to do similar things. So it's kind of innate in life on this planet, with the exception of the really weird stuff that lives like, 10 miles below the ground or something, right? Or in caves. It's kind of basic for life to be very aware and attuned to the daily cycle. Now, exactly how photoperiod is read from that is a complicated matter, but that would be the next step, to know what time of year you're in, where the year is. And it's called phase shifting, and there's a whole body of knowledge on that, but I won't go into it. But anyway, so the idea is that this is a kind of resonance explanation that's based on, recognition of light values and timing, and that, if you're having your Venus return at the same time as your solar return, then that's a certain kind of information that the body, uses in order to regulate itself. So in other words, the cycles, the planetary cycles, are then seen as a kind of scaffolding on which life builds its dynamic qualities, its development, its metabolism, and so on.
Interesting. So that it sort of makes sense. It sort of makes total sense because it thinks about the proximity or where a person is born based on their position on the planet. They're going to have a radically different exposure to what the Earth is like, especially at the moment of birth. Coming into the world in the dark of December or in the northern hemisphere is, far different than coming into the middle of summer, because your experiences are going to be different based on that kind of, like you said, that cellular action responding to the natural place of where they are at that time.
Yeah, I think that there might be something to it. I certainly haven't worked it all out, and there's plenty of problems with the idea, but it's an alternate way of looking at how astrology works. It may account for things biologically, but we have these whole other areas of astrology, like why do we have charts, of countries, and how do we, look at weather? I don't know that. Do you know about my study on Saturn and cold?
No, I don't know that one.
Well, this was published it was in actually Correlation. It's a scientific paper called "Signal from Saturn Found in Daily Temperature Data Sets," and it's a pretty extensive study. I did it for my PhD, and I got past the climatologists and meteorologists there. In fact, the one meteorologist on my PhD committee said, I don't know how to explain what you're doing, but you're doing it right. I'm going to call this voodoo meteorology, but I'm going to pass you because you're not making any mistakes. What I found basically was that if you look at the old almanacs, when the sun makes an aspect to Saturn, these old farmers' almanacs, not the ones today, because they're mentally ill, the people that are doing it. They are so embarrassed about astrology that they're not letting astrologers do it, and they're letting astronomers do it, and they have much worse results. But anyway, if you go back 100 years, go back into the Renaissance, and you see what, or Ben Franklin even, whatever they were doing, Sun square Saturn, cold and dark. Sun opposite Saturn in the winter, like very cold, frost, and you see that over and over again. It's in all the old astrology books. And all the old classic astrology books always had a chapter on astrometeorology.
Yeah.
Anyway, so what I did was I tested it. I went out and got temperature data from all over the world. I probably did 200 studies. And what I found is that some areas were more responsive to the pattern than others, but in the Northeast, there's a really strong case for it getting cold when the sun is opposite Saturn, and more so than with the other aspects, but they're also valid as well. And I have some statistical significance for it when, out of my data set, I extract only the ones that occur near the equinoxes, which means that, at that point, the declination of the sun and Saturn is very low, and that means it's 90 degrees to the poles, and what I think happens is there's an actual gravitational pull that pulls down cold air masses. It's like a tide, where it swells near the equatorial regions and pulls down from the polar regions, and this starts air mass movement towards the south. And
you see this happening when the sun is opposing Saturn.
Yeah. So if you look at my paper, I have it all. I have graphs and everything, and how how it's amplified if it coincides with a full moon right in the same region of the zodiac, and so on. So this seems to me to be more likely a gravitational effect, even though I calculated the gravitational effect of Saturn on Earth's atmosphere, and it's 4 orders of magnitude less than that of the sun, so it's kind of minuscule. But it's there, and there may be a resonance factor, that there's, when you have resonance, you start, you gain a lot more power.
That certainly makes sense. Yeah, I can understand. It's an interesting study. I'm going to have to research it some more and perhaps look up your paper.
Yeah, look at it. It's online. Just go to academia.edu and type my name in there, and I got a few of my papers up there.
Oh, that's great. Definitely will do that. We're talking today with Bruce Scofield. We're having kind of a conversation about some of the logic of astrology. We'll take a quick break here. We'll be back in about 2.5 minutes, but hang in there. We're going to continue our talk, and it's a fascinating discussion, and it's going to answer some questions from many of you, so hang in there. Okay. Hey, welcome back to Turning of the Wheel. My guest today is Bruce Scofield. His website is OneReed. It's ONEREED.com. On there you'll find his books, his articles, and all of his other interesting work that he's done. He's a brilliant astrologer. He's been studying astrology from a very scientific manner, which we don't find very often in astrology. We find a lot of people are more, as we mentioned earlier, more involved in the ideas of sort of the personality types that happen with astrology, because people want to know if they're going to fall in love, when they're going to get rich, things like that. But this astrology that we're talking about here is far more, I think, indicative of the sort of the changes that we're going through as a society and as a, as a species, for that matter. Now, to me, time is a cyclical nature, but it's cyclical much the way a corkscrew is, where it goes around and around, and you come back to these cycles that are similar, but you're in a different place in time, which then alters the outcome, because you're always in a new place in a new time, because time is always moving forward. So when we look at it in that regard, how do we? That's where I begin to see the sort of, especially from the viewpoint of a historian such as yourself, the idea of cycles recurring, only that they occur in different places and times.
Right.
Just the same way that all the stories that were told in Greek mythology are the same stories we're seeing today, except that we're seeing them through different characters and different archetypes. And that's what's changed. It's the characters have changed, but the theme seems to remain the same. Isn't that right, how you see it as well?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's some basis to this idea of archetypes. Jung's idea, he called them primordial images first. Mm-hmm. That they're basic structures that allow an organism to navigate its world, and that they're hardwired into the psyche or the brain hardware. I mean, it's a whole other topic.
It's a whole other topic, yeah.
Yeah,
but it does seem to be a dualistic approach, though, because there is this, like you said, the pluses and the minuses, the ones and the zeros, whatever terminology you want to use, of this duality that happens. For all of the planets that we have that are benefic, we have the malefic planets, and there's this sort of this counterbalance of themes, and it's that between that charge of those two electrical impulses, sort of keeping each other moving, we begin to see all these attributes and events ripple down as a result of what is happening.
Well, judging, benefics and malefics is really a cultural thing.
It is.
If you were, like a monk or something in a monastery, then Saturn is a good force.
Yes. Exactly.
So it's all relative.
A bad force. Yeah, I don't see Saturn.
It's not a malefic
per se. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it as a necessary force. I think Saturn is a necessary force in our lives. I think it helps us become who we are. I think if we didn't have that hardship, we wouldn't be who we are. And so there's a little bit of hardship in everybody's life that has to be there. But when you look at the idea of how do you as in the astrology community, or any of us in astrology, address the idea of the precession of the equinoxes, because that really throws off the whole idea of the logic of time and where we are and what the influences are at the time.
Hold on. Yeah, I got to sneeze there. Okay. Well, the whole issue of precession of the equinox is just in itself is a fascinating subject, and of course that takes us back to the old Mayan calendar business, right?
Mm-hmm.
But won't go there today. What it does do is produce a couple zodiacs, or more than two actually, but a sidereal zodiac, which could be hinged or anchored on any number of points or stars, and then you have a tropical zodiac, which is anchored on the actual physical plane that the Earth orbits in and the plane of the Earth's equator. So they're two very different. The tropical zodiac is seasonal and the sidereal zodiac is not. And we have in astrology today a majority of people in the West using the tropical and a minority using sidereal, but a lot in India using sidereal. And I think there are some issues that have come up, periodically discussed, and that I've been concerned about for a long time, and that's that you can't have it both ways. Right. You can't use the same descriptions for a sign and say they're accurate in both zodiacs. I've had clients come to me, and I start reading their charts. Says, "Oh, but I'm an Aries, and you're saying that I'm a Pisces." And I say, "Well, what did they tell you?" And then I hear these stories that where people, mostly people doing Westerners doing Vedic astrology. They're reading the signs the same way you would read Western, tropical signs, and offering these descriptions, and people are so ignorant of self-knowledge that they fall for it, that they go for it. You know about the Barnum effect, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, you take a classroom and you give everybody a piece of paper with their name, printed out real nice with their name on it and a description of who they are, but it's the same description, and then a little questionnaire saying how accurate was it and all that. Most of the people think it's accurate. So the truth is that people are stupid. They just don't understand themselves because self-knowledge is a forbidden subject in our culture. Just ask Alan Watts.
Yeah.
He wrote that.
Well, you know what it is? It requires a lot of work, and that's what I think people say down. They don't want to do the work.
Yeah, you know that book I'm talking about, the Alan Watts? It's called...
I listen to Alan Watts all the time. I know, I'm very familiar. I listen to his podcast all the time.
Well, Alan Watts, his book, he's dead, obviously, but it's the book, and then the subtitle smaller, Against the Taboo of Knowing Yourself, something like that. And it's really, really interesting because it just reinforces this idea that people in our culture, they don't have a way to think about who they are, so they can easily get suckered by an astrologer.
Easily. Because the astrologer provides them answers. That's just like the woman I was speaking to yesterday. He wanted to get her...
Yeah, you're getting muffled again, Chris. You're getting muffled.
She wanted some, just like the woman I was speaking to yesterday, she wanted some sort of silver lining, and for me to find some silver lining in her chart because she's going through this terrible Pluto thing. But you're right. The idea of this concept of self-knowledge, I think that, well, there's a couple of things that go on there. One part of it is that self-knowledge, it can be actually a fearful thing for some people. They don't want to go there because they don't want to know what they're going to find. And the other part of it is that it requires a great deal of work and presence of mind to really delve into that, and that requires an awful lot of thought. So I think that people become too distracted by an easier out, and they look for that easier out, and they become very sort of superficial, largely based on, especially today, we're largely based on because people are so bombarded with information, we can't even keep our facts straight. A large part of it, I think, is tied to that. But it does come down to a large part of the work, and I think that's what Alan Watts really drives at, is that he's always proposing the idea that we have to learn who we are, and he's got great way of presenting it. I encourage people to listen to his podcast, and he really is a brilliant guy.
He has podcasts?
Yeah, he's got podcasts. You can pick him up on iTunes.
Were they old recordings? He died a long time ago, right?
Yeah. This is an amazing podcast. These are all old recordings, old lectures of his that you can find on iTunes.
Oh wow!
Actually, there's an app called the Alan Watts app. You put the app on your phone, and you've got all of his lectures from all of his life, and they're fascinating. The stages of it. And some of them are short, 16 minutes. Other ones are half an hour. But he's brilliant.
I thought he was.
Incredibly. And he makes it he's very approachable in the way he talks about it. He doesn't get lost in the stars, but literally, he's very logical about his approach.
The thing about self-knowledge is that it's anti-capitalism.
Yes, it's true.
That if you had too much self-knowledge in a capitalistic society, it would implode. Yeah, self-knowledge is, it's okay if you're in a monastery, but in a culture, that's based on, profit and greed, it don't go.
It don't float. That ship don't float. That's
yeah.
Right.
So that's the culture doesn't reinforce it, is what I'm saying. So it's most likely that most people would not, be interested in self-knowledge, or would have even heard about it, or even understood it, as something that you could do.
Well, I think what they want a shortcut. They want a shortcut. Is what they want, essentially. And the shortcut, astrology does provide popular astrology provides a very quick shortcut for people to get insight as to where they are.
Yeah.
I think on a broad-based theme, you can always tell something about, where you're going to be or what the opportunities are in your life at the time. And it is important to be apprised of it, but I do think it requires, like you say, self-knowledge. And, that raises a whole other question. How do people get self-knowledge? How do they? That has to be self-motivated in itself. You can't just say, "I want to be self-knowledge."
Yeah, but I think astrology is one of the best roadmaps available, if not the best, for self-knowledge, and
understanding who you are. Yeah.
It's just
getting your attributes. Yeah.
It's a good way to get through it. But anyway, going back to what I was, getting at in regard to the two zodiacs is that people will believe anything. And you have these, you have people, deeply immersed in, say, Vedic astrology, and and they're, reading these signs as if they're Western signs. You can't have it both ways. And
especially when you get near where they both they blend into one.
Yeah. So it's pretty weird, but if you look at it critically, you'll find that first of all, nearly all the Western astrologers, that do sidereal astrology, the siderealists, do not use the signs as much more than placeholders for the planets. They don't really use them so much for interpretation. Some do. And that's the same case in Hindu astrology, that if you go look at the old books, the zodiac is there as a placeholder, and all the action or the interpretation is based on the houses and the aspects between the planets. Right? So if you were doing sidereal astrology properly, you really wouldn't be talking about the zodiac that much except as a grid. But this is where the problems come in, is that people have decided that these sidereal grids, have interpretive value, and they tend to use the interpretations that have been established by the tropical, tradition, in their place, and you can't do it. I mean, it's just like with the day signs in, ancient Mesoamerican or Mayan, as most people like to call it, astrology, is that, you have a real day sign count that's synchronized, that's consistent with history and so on, and then you have delineations for the different day signs, and then you have this, Jose Arguelles derived count that's completely different, and they use the same delineations. Like when I wrote delineations for the day signs back in the 80s, my delineations were lifted by people writing, other stuff because they couldn't come up with any of their own, and they were using completely different counts. Just same as with the sidereal and tropical zodiac. It's like what are you doing here? These are big differences in time, and just because you have a name, you decide you can use that interpretation, and not only that, not give me credit for it. There's a lot of crazy stuff going on. So, the take-home point here that I'm trying to make is that people just don't know that much about what's going on, and that they don't discriminate, and they don't have critical thinking. And then you bring in a discussion about astrology, and we have to take that into consideration. That we're not dealing with an even playing field. We're dealing with like what's going on in the country now, where you have Fox News and then you have all the rest of the news.
I know, and there's that's like a parallel universe. It's a parallel world that it's just completely and the sheep are blindly following. Unfortunately, they're going one direction or the other, and it's very. I mean, it's very Orwellian in that regard. I mean, it has a real shades of that, especially when you think about how people are responding and the way that they are taking to the streets. And it's sort of like a lemming, they're just blindly following whatever. I mean, I had a conversation with somebody who, before the election, who was saying, "Oh, I'm never going to vote for Hillary because she's working with the Russians," and he stormed out of the store, which is an unusual conversation. I would have to be your sideline if I happen to be overhearing it, and yet, so this guy is an ardent Trump supporter, and you got to look at who's the one in bed with Russia. I mean, come on, it's just a crazy thing to do. And I think that the times we're going through now really reflect the uncertainty, and I think more importantly, probably what I imagine you'll agree, the sort of the literal tearing down of the old, traditional American democratic structure to be rebuilt in some better way. I think what's going on now and all the exposure that's coming about as a result of what's going on will lead us in a different direction. We'll be in a much different place by 2024 or 2030.
Yeah, I think the Uranus-Pluto square really did a number on the United States, and now we're starting to see in the last couple of years the effects of it by what we got as president, and now with transiting Saturn, spending a lot of time opposite the U.S. Sun, and square the U.S. Saturn. We're going to start seeing this taking one, more definite form. Like more facts coming out. That's that's been a problem. Neptune square Saturn. Was I think a big factor in the fake news campaign. And
I think Neptune was huge. I think Neptune, that speaks to the attribute of Neptune itself, just the fact that it's this sort of delusion that looks like the man behind the curtain. Or ignore that man behind the curtain. I mean, that's the perfect metaphor for what we actually have seen unfolding, which is why astrology, I think, and people don't realize is that it's so particularly accurate right now. I mean, it's spot on for where we are, and I think that the time coming up points to a point in time where the corruption is being exposed. It's going to require a new way of moving forward. So it requires a major correction, and I think that's what this Jupiter-Pluto-Saturn conjunction in 2020 is all about. Is that sort of that combination of, a big responsible shift in the way that we move forward. It's sort of like you have to hit bottom before you can climb back out again.
Yeah, I think it's confrontation with reality, and that's not necessarily a good thing, but it's at least. There'll be more facts on the table. That getting back to that Saturn-Neptune square, that was kind of connected to one of the USA ascendants, the commonly used Sibley chart.
Right.
I just kind of went with it, and a lot of misinformation propagated during that time. I don't know if you saw any of my columns that I wrote in the Mountain Astrologer during that period.
I think I did see some. Yeah,
I wrote a bunch of fake columns.
Oh, did you?
Yeah, I had the Martian Astrologer, and I had the Venusian Mirror, and the Dower Astrologer, and each one was built around a planet, and that the whole column was from that planet's point of view. I had the Jovian Giant, the Uranian Observer, the Oracular Neptunian. The probing Plutonian. I don't know. I did them all,
Yeah.
And I didn't put my name on them. The first two I didn't put my name on, and then I told Mountain Astrologers, I don't want any name. I made up fake names for all of them, And
might as well.
So like the Martian Astrologer was Robert Ramses, and and so I wrote. It was a very Martian column, and I didn't have my name on it. And the Mountain Astrologer got a lot of angry letters. Some people were threatening to cancel their subscription if they published anything more by Robert Ramses. And so in my following columns, I kept making derogatory remarks towards Robert Ramses. So I had a whole thing going on, but the Mountain Astrologer editors got a little freaked out by it, and they put a disclaimer in front, and it kind of took the wind out of the sails,
Yeah, because that was kind of a fun little trick you were playing in the background. Yeah. People probably, not everybody picked up on.
They were good columns. Yeah. I mean, I had a lot of good, solid astrology in them.
Yeah.
It was just that with the Dower Astrologer, with the the old Saturnian one, I just happened to do a medieval chart.
Now, with all your knowledge of astrology as well as your scientific background, why is it that you lean more towards Mayan astrology? Is there something that?
Well, I don't necessarily lean more towards it. I mean, the simple answer is I studied Mesoamerican astrology after reading Jacques Soustel's book, Daily Life of the Aztecs, which is a really interesting book. I read it in the late 70s, I guess, and I read that, and I said, and there was a whole chapter on Aztec astrology. I said, "What the hell is this?" They had astrology, and then it's very different, So I thought, well, I should study this, because if I'm going to try to understand what astrology is, why not study it a completely different form of it, And so I did. I went down there in Mexico, and I read what I could, and translated some stuff, and started working with the day signs, and kind of tried to reassemble the system in the way I thought worked, and I learned quite a bit about it. But it's not my main deal. I did read a few books on it, but I wouldn't call it. It's a part of my identity, but I don't know what's my identity. I think of myself as a rock and roll musician.
There you go.
I'm still playing.
Oh, you are? Good for you.
Oh yeah.
Every week? You still play every week?
Oh, not as much. I played twice last week and nothing this week. So yeah.
That's a much more way to look at yourself than being an astrologer. You sort of get lost in the weeds of the astrology.
Yeah.
But the Mayan approach is interesting. You have an interesting thing on your website. The whole thing of that sort of the divination tools you have at the back there.
Yeah.
Where you sort of enter a question, and that's sort of like an oracle of sorts, isn't it? The same idea.
It is. Well, first of all, that website is with Barry Orr and myself. Barry's a programmer and a very good astrologer, but he doesn't do readings. And I did this book with a Mexican psychic. Her name's Angela Cordova, lives in New Jersey, and we came up with these tarot card images for the day signs, the 20-day signs, and we did a little divination package, and I wrote delineations to it. It was in 1985 or something like that, 87, something like that. And Llewellyn published it. It got translated into about 5 different languages. They were selling it in places, Netherlands and Spain and whatever. So it got around. It wasn't a big bestseller or anything, but it was kind of a precursor to a lot of these, divination systems, like what were the animal cards or something like that, and
right,
that sort of thing.
Well, it resonates to sort of the idea of rolling a dice or
it's the same idea.
Ask a question.
Yeah. So that book that I did with her was basically a similar kind of thing, like a tarot runes kind of program, and so I took the text material from that, and Barry created the the algorithm, and then we just put it on the website. And every once in a while somebody tells me they use it all the time and they like it.
And it answers their questions?
Yeah. Yeah, I just made it up,
Yeah. Are you only allowed one question, or can you ask the same question?
Well, you can ask as many times as you want, but
I'm sure you can. Mechanically you can, but if you ask the same question 3 different times with 3 different sets of numbers until you get the one that you want, is that a legitimate way to do it?
Probably not. Would you do the same thing with tarot cards?
Yeah, I know exactly.
But symbol systems are all relative. One of the things I used to do, I had a deck that I made of business cards. I would collect business cards, and I would select the ones. So there's a wide variety of business cards, and maybe about 40 of them in the deck. And after I'd play a gig with my band, we'd be at a diner at 2 o'clock in the morning somewhere, and I would do business card readings for people. I would let them shuffle the deck, and I would deal out a few cards, and then turn them over, and use the information on each card as a cue to an interpretation. And I got really good results. People were, amazed by it. I also had Astro Dice. Do you remember those?
I do remember. I got it set as well.
Yeah, I used to use Astro Dice at the bar. Sometimes I'd be playing at these bars, and at breaks I'd go off and talk to these people, and I'd pull out Astro Dice and answer questions for them. It's divination. I kind of see it as, it's kind of a synchronicity principle. I don't know how to explain it exactly, but something like that.
Yeah, I think it's sort of like that. You have to ask yourself, is it something about the individual and the question that they're asking that is the answer lies within themselves, and it's reflected in the cards or the numbers?
I think that's the answer right there.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the answer. I think that horary chart or a tarot spread is really a symbolic representation of the contents of the consciousness at that moment, and the broader consciousness, including the subconscious.
And you may even know the answer before you ask the question.
Yeah. It's not predicting the future,
Right. You're sort of you're mirroring what's going on within your own psyche at the time and sort of manifesting it that way.
Yeah.
And it makes sense that way because then it's sort of that's always been the case, that the answer really does lie within the individual all the time. It's just a matter of how you parse it out and how you get it, and how you interpret it. Do you interpret it through a dream? Do you interpret it through some sort of a synchronistic event? When I have a synchronistic event happen to me, it happens quite often. Matter of fact, I was walking down the street the other day. I go for a walk every day. I'm walking down the road. All of a sudden, I get a phone call from my girlfriend's daughter, whose name is Lindsay. And then it's right at that same moment, a car drives by me with a vanity plate called Lindsay. And I'm like, holy shit, how did this possibly happen? And it's just one of those synchronistic events. But I've always taken those as positive indicators that something in my life I'm doing something in my life right. And it's one of those things that that's how I interpret synchronistic events. And I'm curious, how do you think of it?
Well, if you look at what the skeptics say, they say it's just coincidence that happens, and that you're aware of it. I'm not sure, what to make of it all. I think that there's a lot about consciousness that we haven't figured out. Origin of life and the nature of the mind are like two big cans of worms that that we're not there yet. We just don't know.
No, we got a long way to go.
But
and I think we're not evolved enough.
Well, I don't know about evolved enough. We just don't have our methods of learning, are not, well adapted to, we've been learning a lot by using a mechanical model. And, but that's another thing. But I think in divination, what you're really getting is exactly what you said. It's the contents of your own mind. And that dawned on me. I remember in 1970, dawned on me very strongly. I was in my apartment at Fat City, this hippie commune that I was living in at the time, and it was the time of the Saturn-Neptune opposition. Yeah. And that's when all those rock stars died, like Hendrix and Janis Joplin and Jim Morrison and all that. They were all dropping at that time. But I guess I was, I'd probably smoked a joint and got out my tarot deck and started doing this reading. I had this like incredible hour period where I was engaged in this amazing dialogue with myself, with the cards, with the symbolism of the cards. It was just like I was playing like a brilliant solo on the guitar and not having to think about it. It was all muscle memory,
Muscle memory, or perhaps just you were a vehicle of it. You were a channel.
Yeah, and that really gave me this insight into what's really going on in these divination systems. It's a feedback loop, between the symbols that you happen to be using and the contents of your mind, mostly your subconscious, I think, but certainly your consciousness. So that's kind of answered my question. I never really took it much further. But I did that thing in the 80s with the divination system for the Maya, and that is also based to some extent on what's still practiced in remote areas of Guatemala and Mexico today. They have day keepers that carry a bag of seeds and crystals, and you grab a handful, or they grab a handful, and they throw it out, and they arrange them in piles. And this leads to some numbers, and then they know the count of the calendar at the present time, and they add some numbers to that, and they wind up with a day sign number combination and a few other things that is relevant to them, and they use that as their tarot spread or their horoscope. And the odd thing about that is that the day count system is arranged, it's based on a pattern that resonates very strongly with astronomical data, particularly Venus. So there's a weird geocosmic link to that divination system. It's not just freelance like, I Ching or runes or tarot or my business cards.
Really fascinating. I mean, they really are. They're sort of a vehicle for allowing us to explore what we already know. I think as we mentioned before, it's sort of just a way of, it's a presentation tool in some way by having this tangible spread of rocks or stones or dice or whatever, or cards. It's sort of just as a reflection of what happens. But it's amazing stuff to study.
Yeah.
Well, we've come to the end of our hour. It's always fascinating talking to you, Bruce. I want to remind you all to go to his website. It's OneReed, ONEREED. So it's one and then REED.com. On there you'll find his books. You're teaching down in Florida, lucky you, on January 27th to the 24th, 24th to the 27th, rather, at the Kepler conference down there.
Yeah, it's going to be warmer.
Yeah, it'll be a lot warmer. What's your topic going to be down there, Bruce?
I'm doing 2 talks. One's on the history of theoretical astrology. In other words, a little bit like what we were talking about today, different theories of astrology. But I'm going to start with the Babylonians, and go up. And the other one is I'm going to talk about a study that I did on a 1,500-year cycle that involves conjunctions of Uranus, Neptune, and Saturn, and how they are reflected in climate data.
Huh. Wow, fascinating. And it's right there, and especially if you can have a historical background to back it up, you're good to go.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Anyway, one read is Bruce's website, ONEREED.com. On there, you'll find a lot of interesting stuff. Great Mesoamerican astrology, as well as Mayan Aztec reports and other forms of astrology. And he's always available for consultations.
Not too often on the readings. I'm retired. I do very few. I do some.
Yeah.
You'd have to have a good reason.
Yeah. Going through a Pluto transit. The Day Signs is a Native American astrology from ancient Mexico. It's also out of print for a long time. It's now being published by the Wessex Astrologer out of England, which would be nice to get that back. And that's going to be coming out again when?
That's out, and stupid Amazon has got it all screwed up. If you type in Day Signs, you get the old edition, and you have to fish around to find the new one, and that's frustrated, them and me, and I've talked to Amazon many times to try to get straightened out. And the reason why is there's about a dozen people that have new copies of the old book, and because some new copies exist, they won't change the listing. That's one of the reasons they give me. But the thing is, there really shouldn't be any new. These are returns that, like I shipped something out to a store and they never sold them or something. That's what it is. It goes from way back.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Anyway, again, my guest has been Bruce Scofield. His website is OneReed, ONEREED.com. I encourage you to go there. And if you're in Florida on the 24th of January to the 27th, seek him out at the Kepler Conference while you're there, or check out the Kepler Conference website as well. So, Bruce, thank you so much for coming on today.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Always fun to talk to you, and we'll touch base again soon.
All right.
Take care. Bye-bye.
You've been listening to Turning of the Wheel with your host, Chris Flisher. To schedule a reading with me or to order artwork, you may visit my website at www.turningofthewheel.com. That's www.turningofthewheel.com. Or you can call me at 978-393-1036. Thank you. And as always, be open to possibilities.